Before the game launched, we knew that houses were not going to be part of Solar Crown. This, of course, was extremely upsetting, as houses are a core feature of Test Drive Unlimited, one that goes so far that it directly affects how many cars you can own at any given time. But over the last month or so, we've actually gotten 2 separate instances of Kiloton sneakily officially confirming houses for the game's second year. So let's start by recapping everything we know officially. Firstly, houses were mentioned in the Year 1 roadmap video as a long-term reflection, but now that's been bumped to a confirmed Year 2 feature. For context, Year 2 will start in October, and each season will continue to be 3 months long. Something major they outlined in the original video was how they weren't quite happy about how the houses were in TDU 2. Specifically, they mentioned the social sides of things.
I don't think we should just repeat what was done in TDU 2, because in the end we all had our house, but we didn't share it much because everyone started in their own house and then went free riding. It was a bit of a solo experience, even though it was very cool.
And in fairness, although you could invite people over, there was really nothing to do once they got there. You couldn't even sit down. Not that you can in Solar Crown either, but you get the point. We do know that TDU 2 was actually a rushed game, so perhaps some of the things we might see introduced in the new house feature will actually be kind of cut content from TDU 2. Personally, I would love if they could add mini-games like a pool table, or a putting green, or chess, or mahjong. You get the idea. Just that sort of thing to help with the social aspect. Unfortunately though, that is kind of everything we know officially. However, we can make some pretty decent, well-educated speculation. So before we go around sprinkling the map with house locations, we first need to find out how many houses we actually need. For this scenario, let's say they do actually tie the amount of cars you can own to a physical garage space. That means that we'd need space for at least one of every car with a tiny bit of future-proofing. And based on the current info, it's looking like Solar Crown will have about 130 cars by the end of Year 2. Pair that with an average garage size of about 6 cars, and you'll end up with roughly 22 houses needed, or rather 21 houses, since we'll still have the 6-car garage in the Solar Hotel. You may think that Solar Crown's map might struggle given its size, but Hong Kong Island has a trick up its sleeve, being how dense it is. Here I am in one of my favorite roads in the entire game, yet I'm certain most people barely come here or even know where this is, which makes it the perfect candidate for a house location. You don't really want a house to be on a busy road you pass all the time, and you'll find in older TDUs they always try to tuck them away nicely when possible. So if you follow this same formula, you can easily find a few spots in each of the 14 districts. A weird misconception people often have is that the island's properties would just be apartments, and while that would be the case for the vast majority of Hong Kongers, TDU isn't about the vast majority.
And here is your gift. Happy birthday!
It's about a rich lifestyle, and sure enough, the island is home to many luxurious houses and mansions ranging all the way up to 2.2 billion Hong Kong dollars, or about 99 new Bugatti Chirons, which is pretty nuts to say the least. Now, originally this video was going to go over each property location that I'd outlined, but that ended up being a tad boring, so instead we'll quickly skim over some key details. We've already mentioned some of the high-end houses, but the reason the high life feels so cool in TDU games is that it also emphasizes the grind to get there, and it'd be pretty boring if everything was the same uber-rich house too. And after driving around the northeastern districts for a bit, I actually found quite a few blocks of flats that, to me, felt quite reminiscent of that first house you buy in TDU 1. Contrasting this, there are several districts home to insanely expensive houses, with the most obvious contender being Victoria Peak. Since before the launch of the game, One of my greatest annoyances with the map was the fact that Victoria Peak itself wasn't actually in the game as a drivable road. So perhaps they've been holding out on us to give us the absolute peak property just for that. There's also a couple of other super rich districts which you might not expect. The first being Happy Valley, with these 8 villas overlooking the main city, the racetrack, and can even see all the way over to Kowloon. Secondly, you also have Aberdeen. In my last video, I mentioned how most of this town near the German dealership was completely missing. Well, as it turns out, that residential area, Chosen Hill, is home to several of the most expensive properties on the island, including the most expensive property on the island. So it'd be pretty interesting to see what Solar Crown does in this scenario. Furthermore, this is also home to a massive boat parking area with several marina and yacht clubs, which, need I say more, is super fitting for interjecting a TDU style yacht. And before we move on to Ibiza, I'd like to give an honorable mention to the district of Shek. Oh, being the only other district I thought was fair to delegate 2 properties to. It's a super cool district in real life, and part of that does translate in-game, especially down by the south with the Cape de Aguila area. It's super peaceful and quiet, and offers a pretty picturesque view of the archipelago. Then you also have the Big Wave Bay area, which in fairness did get fucked over by the devs, but the Tainamara resort should offer a brilliant location for a seaside mansion overlooking the beach and I guess what you might consider the remains of the village. Now with that all said, I think you can see why Hong Kong Island is pretty goated, especially with such diverse areas to erect some TDU2 style houses. But now it's time we move on to Ibiza. Going back to what I said at the start, I said we'd need about 21 houses. Now in our scenario, we've already given Hong Kong 16 of them, with one of them being the yacht that you'll find on both islands. So how are we going to fit the last 5/6 houses in Ibiza? Simple, we just aren't. Let's take a step back and think about this for a moment. The devs have already shown that they care a hell of a lot more for Ibiza than the game's base map, whether it's the attention to detail, withholding simple assets like flowers, or overall making it feel way more tropical, despite not actually being a tropical island, unlike Hong Kong. I think it's fair to say we'll likely see an Ibiza expansion within the next 18 months. So for us, we're going to use the breadcrumbs that the devs have left for us in the form of the out of bounds area. Now, if you don't already know by now, it's actually possible to get out of bounds via a funny glitch. And if you're careful, there's actually about a third of the island's terrain for you to explore. However, although the majority of it is just terrain with nothing else, there's actually a decent chunk of it with some roads mapped out, which correlates with the real world island. So we'll use this area for our hypothetical scenario for houses, as Ibiza is quite sparse in terms of interesting things, but 30 square kilometers should give us ample space to put 5 or 6 houses. Let's start off with the southwest. Here is where you'd expect the airport to be, however the roads do strategically stop just before then. So most of the expansion area will probably be more of the same residential areas we already have. But crucially, it will give us access to the Ibiza Boat Club, just next to the SVV beach. This is probably the most sensible location for the Hong Kong yacht, since the main port area is absolutely dominated by the Selenay hub. Moving north, we have probably the coolest area of the expansion, as it has these huge mountains which contrast greatly to the relatively flat and samey feeling of Eisa. Unfortunately though, it doesn't quite expand into the vineyard areas, which to me feels extremely WRC-esque, but it does include this quarry, because of course Ibiza gets its quarry and Hong Kong Island doesn't get it, and yada yada yada, with a secluded private road leading to this gorgeous mountainside mansion. So perhaps this might be the perfect spot for your off-roaders, as I'm sure there'll be some form of connection from this road to the quarry. Moving even further north though, we get to the place where TDU2 lied to you, and you notice there isn't actually a rocky canyon desert on Ibiza. Instead, there are several industrial areas by the main motorway. However, the area beside it, called Monte Cristo, is a nice, normal-ish village for a mid-range house. Remembering that it can't all be high-end properties. But you can chuck that out of the window as we move further east to the hill near Candeso, with these massive grand villas overlooking the Ibiza area. There's several complexes here, complete with pools and fluorescent green grass patches, contrasting against Ibiza's arid nature, perfect for perhaps one of the final high-end houses on the island. However, as we move on back down south, just to the west of the playable area, there's a few interesting side roads that taper off from the district of Puigmanya. This is probably a nice place for a quieter coastal house without having to be too far away from Ibiza itself. And speaking of which, our final house for Ibiza is actually going to be back in Ibiza itself. Now, you could argue that it's way too close to the already existing Selene hub. The thing I noticed about TDU2 was that it actually kept the majority of the properties on Oahu from TDU1. Of course, this again could have been because the game was rushed, but I thought it was a nice idea to attempt to recreate it in some way. Ibiza house in TDU2 is located here. Nope, that's not a joke. It is actually located right here in the middle of the park. So either we could set up a camper van here, which I feel like some people might not actually be opposed to, or we relocate it nearby. And the adjacent road is kind of perfect for this. In real life, this is a gigantic, boring grey parking lot, but obviously the devs being how they are, favouring Ibiza greatly, they did massively spruce it up to be this extravagant park with apartment blocks on either side, which is perfect for Ibiza house, which is actually just a rooftop flat with a pool, so it wouldn't actually be a crazy change to the area, and you'd also have a decent view of the hub in the distance. So perhaps this is actually just perfect for the first location you could buy in Ibiza, being right outside the hub, and ironically, as close as this is to the hub, I don't think this road actually gets driven on very much either. And with that, we've finally concluded our speculative placement for every house to come in year 2. Of course, this isn't official, but it'll be super interesting to see how close it ends up to Solar Crown's implementation of houses. Something we'll probably learn a tiny bit more about in the upcoming dev diary in about a week's time. But for now, I hope you have a nice rest of the week, and I'll see you next time. Bye!